Hi, everyone. I hope everyone has had a great day so far. I know it's the latter part of the day, that time of day where normally, at least for me, I'm rinsing out my coffee cup and putting things to the side with little notes that says tomorrow's task. But we're here today, as Mr. Bussey said, for the Texas NARO 2020 virtual presentation for Phas. So thank you so much for joining us today. Before I go any further, I would like to acknowledge that we have a newly promoted division director, Miss Eva Fulton, who is not new to PIH, but she's new to the position of division director in the Fort Worth field office. And I have the honor of working under her. And prior to being promoted, Ms. Fulton was the Phas SME for our office. So I have some big shoes to fill here with Ms. Fulton being my division director and the former Phas SME. So I hope I do well with that. Uh,
You'll
so
do fine. You'll do fine.
so before I get started with the full presentation, I would just like to do, I guess, like an overview of FOSS. I think it's important to know a little background so we can make a connection to actually what's going on today with FOSS. So with that, let's get into it. Just briefly, Phas first came out in 1998. And when I saw that, I was thinking, what was I doing in 1998? And I remembered I was carefree, I was kid free. Um, I had black hair, thanks to Miss Clairol. But all of that now has definitely changed. But it first came out in 1998. I believe some 13 years later or so, there was the FOSS. Let me change this screen so I can see. I'm sorry. I'm apologizing. Some 13 years later or so, there was the announcement of the implementation of the FOSS interim rule. And with that interim rule, there were some changes made, some significant changes. You had the elimination of self-certifications, and you also had the elimination of RAS, which was the resident assessment portion for FOSS, and replaced with that with the additions were the CFP component and what is known as the 321 physical inspection incentive. And we will talk a little bit, we will talk more about that later on. But basically, the 321 incentive is where if you're a high performer, of course, you are scored every 3 years. If you're standard or substandard, you will get every other year. And if you're troubled or CFP trouble, you will get scored annually. And the scoring changed by uh, point system also a little bit. Fast and Mass were 30 points, but with the implementation of the FOSS interim rule, they went to 25 points. And then also a pretty big change in the physical scoring. Before the FOSS interim rule, physical was 30 points, but with the implementation of the FOSS interim rule, it changed to 40 points. And you can see beginning here with the implementation of the FOSS interim rule, there started being more weight given to the physical aspect of FOSS. Um, Leading up to where we pretty much are now with Inspire. So from the FOSS, from the implementation of the FOSS interim rule, we have now Inspire, which is another step to overhaul REACT's 20-year-old inspection process. With this, HUD has indicated a new series of changes, and the focus is on people, properties, and programs. That's Inspire's focus. they're really looking at the livability and health and safety standards. And it's about the safety and quality of residents' homes. So that's the focus of Inspire. And currently, as most of you know, Inspire is in the demonstration stages, which began in late 2019, but there are currently some short-term changes that have already taken place. And some of you may have felt those already. uh, but if you recall, prior notifications were sometimes as much as 120 days prior to the inspection, which normally averaged more about 60 to 90 days, not so much 120, but 60 to 90. But to go from there to 14 days, they have reduced the ability to reschedule and reduce the amount of time of notification for inspection. And this was done to encourage year-round maintenance. So that is like one of the big changes for Inspire, that notification change. Um, I would like to point out that understanding REACT compliance is really about understanding the rules for physical compliance and realizing that they are quite different from assisted housing standards. For assisted housing, most rules are very specific, procedures and for with procedures and expectations to follow. Um, but with REACT, they have a minimum standard for failure, meaning that as executive directors, you have to exceed the minimum standard. And in doing that, you really have to have a discerning eye for, for the issues at all times. You have to go back and double check the processes and standards as it relates to REACT compliance. I think here it's very important also to understand that your leadership as executive directors is very important when it comes to REACT. And it's important that you have skilled staff working with you, that you ensure accurate and timely reporting, um, and that these things work together, hopefully to ensure that you get a great REACT score. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. So from I just wanted to give that a little bit of an overview before we jump into the nuts and bolts of things. And this is where we'll start here with Phas. And I think pretty much everyone knows what Phas is. It's a system of accountability for public housing, and it should be used as a management tool by the EDs. It's designed to, fairly measure a PHA at the end of its fiscal year. Phas scoring. I think this is pretty straightforward in regard to scoring. It's scored on a 100-point system. You have PASS, 40 points, Phas, 25 points, MAS, 25 points, and CFP, 10 points. The scores are generated for each development and then combined into the agency-wide score using the integrated assessment subsystem known as NAS. We have so many acronyms at HUD, my goodness, hard to keep up with sometimes. We've used every alphabet in the system. But NAS compiles and reviews and produces a composite FOS score for the housing authority. And this score is used to determine the PHA's designation under FOS. And it's the most recent REACT score that determines when the next inspection will take place. This is a FOS score breakdown. 90 to 100, you're inspected every 3 years, and everyone, we should shoot for that. That's our goal, 90 to 100. 80 to 89, the property is inspected every 2 years. 79 and below, the property is inspected every year. And of course, I would like to mention that sometimes you see these little alphabets after your score. And if you see the alphabet of A, you know that you have no health and safety deficiencies. If you see the alphabet of B, you know there are none life-threatening health and safety deficiencies that have been noted. If you see C, you have at least one life-threatening health and safety deficiency that has been noted by the inspector. And if you see this little asterisk, you have at least one inoperable smoke detector. Um, so that explains sometimes when you see that little alphabet behind your score, that explains what that means there. Um, we all want to shoot for being high performers, because what happens when you're a high performer, of course, you have fewer reviews, less monitoring by HUD. You get public recognition, which is always good, and you happen to get bonus points in HUD funding competitions. Say, for instance, if there's a notice of funding availability, you're a high performer, you would get bonus points for that. Um, if you're standard or substandard, you may be required to operate under a corrective action plan. Um, and if you're substandard, you will be required to operate under a corrective action plan if deficiencies have not been corrected. And if you're troubled or CFP trouble, CFP meaning financially, you have to sign a memorandum of agreement with HUD, where HUD will work with your agency for 1 year, but you must show a significant improvement during that time. And within 2 years, you must have an overall Phas score of 60% or more. So I'm pretty sure what every agency hopes to do is not to have, HUD involved in the crevices, every part of the agency. So we all want to shoot for high performer. And I'm sure all our agencies within Texas are that high performing agencies. Looking at Phas, and what is the purpose of Phas, which is the physical assessment subsystem. It is to determine whether public housing units are decent, safe, and sanitary, and in good repair. And that's really HUD's mission, right? To make sure that we provide our clients with decent, safe, and sanitary housing. Very important to us. Phas is scored following the Uniform Physical Condition Standards. And the major inspection areas under UPCS are site, building exterior, building systems, common areas, and unit. But let me say this as an aside, with Inspire now, the focus is more on unit than common areas, building systems, and building exterior. Not that that's not important, but again, as I mentioned before, they're really looking at the livability of our clients' units. So I would say, as before, we would probably give about 60 to 70% of our time looking at the building exterior, building systems, and common areas. It may be 30 to 40% on the unit. And that's actually flipped with the introduction of Inspire, where now the focus is on the unit and the curb appeal is still important, but not as it was before. Still important, but Focus more on your unit now when you're going through and doing your inspections. Scoring system places the past scoring system places a huge importance, as I said, on health and safety findings. And these usually show up outside of the units, looking at electrical hazards, trip hazards, things like graffiti, damaged foundations, plumbing, and mechanical systems. You could get your maximum points on the outside areas looking at these particular things here. A lot of people ask, can you improve your pass score? And the answer to that is definitely a resounding yes. And you can do it by following some of these key things that are listed, understanding and complying with the UPCS, conducting your own inspections at regular intervals throughout the year. That is highly encouraged. That is definitely a way to increase your pass score. Make sure you go through every unit and the common areas once per quarter and fix any deficiencies on the spot. Don't wait. Do it when you see it. And more importantly, educate your staff about REACT inspections and the importance of them, because that's your scorecard. And you want to be at that 90 to 100%. Created a little chart here so you can see a possible past preparation timeline. I would say 3 to 6 months before your inspection. Try to identify work that will require a contractor or special material to complete. You want to do this and get ahead of things. If you see something that's really big, 3 to 6 months before the inspection is the time to start focusing on that. About 2 months before, focus on repairing electrical hazards, plumbing problems, mechanical problems, um, blocked entrances and exits. Possibly 1 month or so before your inspection, look to see if any repairs are taking longer than usual. And you may want to consider bringing in additional help with that to get that repair done. At least 1 week before your inspection, schedule a run through of the entire property and uncover any possible deficiencies that you may have somehow overlooked. And the date of the inspection, make sure that your lawns are well and manicured, trash is picked up, and the common area bathrooms are clean. Now, what happens when you get a score and the score is under 60, which means you fail, and no one wants to fail, right? You're like, what can I do? There must be a way to get those points back. And you thinking somehow this has to be something bogus. I cannot have scored a 60. But there is a way. I tell people, don't give up hope, don't be discouraged. There is a way you can look at getting some of those points back. But when you get that report, go through it thoroughly. Take your time going through it, because you may be able to do an appeal, a database adjustment, or a technical review. And with the appeal, you have to make sure that you have some type of justifiable error, which would justify them changing your score. And you want to look at things like material errors, and there are 3 types of material errors that may take place. You may have a building data error, and the inspection report may include the wrong building or a building that is not owned by the property. You may have a unit count error, meaning that the total number of units considered in scoring is incorrect as reported at the time of the inspection. or you may have what they call a non-existent deficiency error. And the inspection cites a deficiency that did not actually exist at the time of the inspection. And if any of these things take place, you can request a technical review within 30 days from the date of the physical inspection report release date. Also, there are circumstances that may be addressed by a database adjustment, where there are local conditions and exceptions or ownership issues, things that are outside the ordinary that could result in a database adjustment. You may have adverse conditions beyond the owner's control that may result in a database adjustment, or some type of modernization work in progress that may result in a database adjustment. One example that Eva and I were talking about earlier in the week, adverse conditions beyond the owner's control. I did have one housing authority that actually the back of the property abutted the city's property. The city's property was actually in a flood zone. So when that property flooded, the water would pool in the back of the authority's property. So when the clients would walk out, it was just like walking in a pool of water. And that was counted as a deficiency against the housing authority. But what the housing authority did, they had records showing that they had been going to the city, asking them to do, I believe it was called grading, so the water would not pool in the back of the property. They were showing this was a city issue, and they had tried to work this issue out, and they were getting it worked out. The city was just slow moving. So they were able to get those points back because of that. That was an issue that resulted in a database adjustment and resulted in their score being increased. Eva, can you think of anything else an example that can be given?
Like for a database adjustment.
Yes.
Yeah, there's one of our housing authorities in the portfolio is going through a RAD project, and so they're having some issues moving in and out of their portfolio through their CHAP, and so they request a review on getting an improvement on their score because of what's going on with the RAD.
Okay, I hope everyone heard that.
Sorry, it was feedback. I could hear it here.
That's okay. That's okay. That's okay. I wanted to talk a little bit here about the impact of COVID-19 on Phas. As we all know, COVID-19 has presented some challenges for HUD and our PHAs, especially with complying with some of the deadlines. Phas being one of the deadlines that the PHAs have to comply with. But under the CARES Act, which was signed into law in March of this year, it provided HUD with some broad authority in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic to waive statutes and regulations for our public housing authorities and HCV programs. One of the waivers that was implemented through PIH Notice 2020-13 was the waiver of the Phas inspection requirement. For a PHA that had a Phas score pending as the date of this notice, and for any PHA with a fiscal year ending on or before December 31st, 2020, HUD will not issue a new Phas score unless the PHA requests one be issued. And I'm thinking if you're a high performer or standard at this time, why would you request a new score to be issued? What HUD will do instead is carry the score forward. The most recent score will be carried forward. and HUD will resume issuing new Phas scores beginning with PHAs with a fiscal year end date of March 31st, 2021. If you have any questions about that, please put that in the chat and we can go over that. With the waiver of the Phas inspection requirement, questions have come out, when will REAC inspections resume? Well, some of you may have gotten this already. I think starting around September 21st, inspections were to begin. Inspection notices, I believe, were to go out. I think on October 5th, which was Monday, inspections will be prioritized based on COVID-19 data. And you can go to the REACT website for this information. On their website, they list low-risk counties, given 45 days prior to the start of the physical inspection. And at the end of that 45-day period, REACT will notify each property 14 days prior to the actual scheduled inspection. Again, if you have any questions, please put that in the chat room and we will address it. Looking at MAS, the next component of Phas. The purpose of MAS is to assess the PHA's management capabilities and operations. MAS is scored by information reported to HUD by the PHA and FDS, and that's the financial data schedule. FDS, excuse me, is a required report that is sent by the PHA to both HUD and REACT 60 days after the fiscal year end for the unaudited financial data and 9 months after the end of the fiscal year for audited data. The sub-indicators that are looked at for MAS are occupancy, which is given a score of 16 points, residence accounts receivable, which is given a score of 5 points, and accounts payable, which is given a score of 4 points. And there are a couple of things that I did want to cover here in regards to occupancy, which I think are very important. It's important, I think some housing authorities miss this. It's very important to understand exempted units. So you're able to receive your proper credit and subsidy for those. And exempted units are vacant units undergoing capital work on HUD approved schedule, special use units, litigation, disasters, which are federal declared or state declared, and casualty losses, damaged units that remain vacant due to delays. I often tell PHAs, and as Eva had taught me, please ensure that FDS line item 11190 is reduced for the exempted units to maximize your score for this indicator. Please remember that HUD uses data you submit on your FDS for the occupancy calculation. Eva, did I state that correctly there?
Yes, and I just put in the PIH notice 2011-7 as a referral for those exempted units.
Okay, great. I just think that's important that you all make sure to cover that when you're looking at your MAS. In regards to tenant accounts receivable, make sure to write off all vacated balances at year end. And make sure you create repayment agreements for active families under line item 128 for fraud receivables or line item 127 for notes receivables. Is that correct, Eve? I want to make sure I have those line items correct. I'm pretty sure I do, but.
Yeah, I can pull up the calculation real fast.
Okay. And with accounts payable, make sure you pay off as many invoices before the end of the year as possible. Very important to do. See. Next, we're looking at ways to improve your math score. Pretty simple. Make sure you can increase the number of occupied units or reduce your vacancies, collect rents on time, reduce accounts payable by paying your bills on time, review your maintenance reports, and monitor your resident move out and turnover rate. This is all important for mass. And track your move out to reoccupancy dates as best possible. Remember that, uh, remember downtime, make ready time, and lease up time. All these are very important to track under mass. Anything additional to add there, Eva?
So on the tenants accounts receivable, that's FDS line 126 divided by FDS line 70300. I put it in the chat, and I can upload the REACT reports, the REACT training for these documents too.
Okay, thanks, Eva. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Next, we'll move on to Phas. And what is the purpose of Phas? I think it's pretty clear. The purpose of Phas is to measure the financial condition of each public housing development. Phas is determined by the data reported to HUD by the PHA into the financial data system. And the FDS is a required reporting that is sent by the PHA to HUD in REACT 60 days after the end of the fiscal year for the unaudited financial data, and 9 months after, excuse me, after the end of the fiscal year with the audited data. And the sub-indicators that are looked at under Phas are the quick ratio, months expendable, net ratio, and the debt service coverage ratio. And the points are out to the side. For quick ratio, 12 points. For MENAR, 11 points. And for the debt service coverage ratio, 2 points. I thought something that was pretty quick and easy to remember for Phas, I call them the Phas fundamentals. Remember quick ratio, remember that cash fuels operations, and the lack of it can definitely push a housing authority into insolvency. And that's what we don't want. For a PHA, cash is needed to pay immediate expenditures such as salaries, invoices, suppliers, and the purchase of inventory. When you think about MENAR, remember that HUD is measuring the PHA's ability to operate using its available unrestricted net resources without relying on additional funding. So HUD is measuring the adequacy of your reserves. In regard to the debt coverage ratio, remember that HUD is measuring the PHA's ability to produce enough cash to cover its debt payments. I thought those were just some very easy fundamentals to remember in regard to those subcategories under Phas. Any questions, Eva, that we need to answer?
Not so far. Megan thanked us for the resources. So I've uploaded the REACT training that came out when all of these updated Phas scores came out in 2013. All of that is in the chat box.
Okay, great.
But Megan's asking a question. How might CARES Act funding impact the PHA's Phas score? Do you want me to go ahead and answer that?
Sure.
All right. So Megan, that's actually a really great question. So and in fact, we've seen some emails come through to us here in the office of some of the folks who are getting some of the public housing shortfall funds. So this is a great opportunity where if you would normally draw down your operating reserves, operating funds from, locks, you can now put that into your reserves, your operating reserves to pump up your reserve for the calculation, and then use the CARES funding to actually fund the operations that you're needing to use, whether it's your salaries or buying some of the, other, COVID related items. So it's just a matter of and you can't use the CARES Act to put that into the reserves. So it's kind of a strategy on how you're using that funding to plus up the reserves with your regular operating funds. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, thank you so much.
You're
Thanks,
welcome.
Megan. Any other questions, Eva?
Nope, you can keep going.
Okay.
Oh, somebody else just said, I thought for the shortfall, you had to draw down as you used it more like CFP rather than pull it down into the reserves. Yes, that's basically what I said. You're gonna use those as you need it. Let's say for next week's salaries, you draw down your CARES Act funds and use it for the salaries. And then your operating funds that you would have pulled down out of blocks, that's what you put into the reserves. Oh, I think I'm still saying it. I still think I'm saying the same thing, just a different way. Yeah, he got it.
Okay. Next, we can move on to how can a PHA improve their Phas score? Pretty simple. Maintain accurate financials. Submit your financial reports to HUD on time. Increase your quick ratio by increasing available cash and reducing accounts payable. And increase months expendable net assets ratio by increasing your savings in the bank and reducing operating costs. The impact of COVID on both MAS and FAS. So both MAS and FAS requires the PHAs to submit financial information annually, as we've talked about, to HUD and REACT. And I gave you the time periods. The PHAs, but what's important here is that there have extended some due dates in regard to the submissions of your audited financial reports. So PHAs with the fiscal year end of June 30, 2019, September 30, 2019, December 31st, 2019, and March 31st, 2020. Here are your extended deadlines. You have, if you're 6/30/19, your deadline has been extended to 9/30/2020. If you're 9/30/2019, your deadline has been extended to 12/31/2020. If you're 12/31/2019, your deadline has been extended to 3/31/2020. And of course, if you're 3/31/2020, your deadline has been extended through 6/30/2021. PHAs with the fiscal year end of December 31st, 2019 and March 31st, 2020, and a deadline to submit unaudited financial information. The deadlines have been extended as follows. If you're 12/31/2019, it's been extended to 8/31/2020. And if you're 3/31/2020, your deadline has been extended through 11/30/2020.
Yeah, and the 6/30s were just extended on this one of these last notices that just came out too. So I'll post that in the chat. I think it's 10 10:30, I think is what they.
I think, yeah, 10:30. I believe you're right, Eva, 10:30. Looking at CFP and what is the purpose of CFP? The purpose of the CFP assessment is to ensure that the PHAs obligate 90% or more of their funds as quickly as possible and no later than 2 years after funds become available. Also to ensure that the modernization of units and to improve overall occupancy, which aligns with HUD's goal to meet the need for quality, affordable housing. I think we talked about this earlier, Eva, I'm not sure. We were talking about obligating faster. You know, it's really no reason to hold those funds there like for 2 years. Is that something we talked about earlier in our staff meeting? You recall that, Eva?
Yeah, right. You got to think about what is a strategy to get your units ready for an inspection. You know, if you're trying to hold off on those funds until the end of the fiscal year or the end of the obligation time, then you're not getting the units fixed in a timely manner, and that kind of goes against the having the units ready at all the time, right? Because if they're going to give you 14 days notice and for an inspection and you're waiting, waiting to the end, chances are you're not going to get those units fixed in time for the inspection. So this is really about drawing down the funds in a timely manner, getting the units ready and keeping them maintained at all times, not just getting it ready for an inspection.
Right. Let's see here. How is CFP scored? The CFP uses information reported in logs for scoring, and the scores are assigned by the following sub-indicators. Fund obligation, 5 points, and the occupancy rate, 5 points, for a total of course, 10 under CFP. How can a PHA improve CFP scoring? Ensure timely obligation of capital program funds by tracking your obligations made and your obligation end dates. Plan for the use of your PHA's capital funds, as Eva had mentioned before, and increase your occupancy and observe and achieve obligation and expenditure deadlines.
You know, Regina, I want to add on something here too, that it's not just about the CFP scoring, but there is an adage that we use in the federal government, no matter what program you're in, you know, you use the funds or you lose the funds. What message is a housing authority sending if they're not using their funds timely, or if they're, waited past the deadline and then had, 10, 20, $30,000 recouped because they did not spend the money timely? That lets the government know that you don't need those funds. So don't expect to think that you're going to get that same budget authority next year. They'll take that into account, and there's going to be an offset of those funds that were recaptured. So use it or lose it.
Use it or lose it. Briefly, just the impact of COVID-19 on CFP. HUD has extended both the obligation end date and expenditure end date for all capital fund grants that were open on April 10th, 2020 by 1 year from the obligation and expenditure end date in locks. And that was in effect on April 10th, 2020. I just wanted to make sure to mention that. And at the end here, I just provided some resources for you in case you're interested. Eva has also put some within the chat. So please feel free to go and review those as you need to. That is the end for me, unless there are any questions. You have any in the chat, Eva?
No, we've been keeping up with them all as we go. So I don't know if you can open it up, you can unmute yourselves and feel free to ask any questions.
Hi, this is Megan. I had a quick question.
Hi, Megan.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. I appreciate it. It's very helpful.
Yes, ma'am.
I did just have a question. If the reporting standards, I understand that they're building a new portal for reporting of CARES Act funds, and that may be released later this year. I was just curious if that would impact any of the reporting standards for Phas or for any of the fund reports that you just mentioned.
Not that I'm aware of. I have not heard them mention anything on the calls about that, because those are lines. Everything about the FOS score are line items that you're putting in your FDS submissions. So while CARES Act is one thing, it has nothing to do with the actual FOS score, because your occupancy is still your occupancy. Tenants accounts
It is still your
receivable.
financial data, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I actually have one more question now that I think about it.
Okay.
Ask away.
Occupancy. For occupancy, you mentioned nationally or state disasters. Would COVID-19 count as a national disaster or state declared disaster that could result in an exempted unit?
I would think so.
That's a good question. I would submit that to the CARES Act and see if that would be an authorized reason. I know that all of the messaging that we've been hearing is that we're supposed to keep encouraging housing authorities to keep leasing units, calling families off your waiting list, because they have more need now than probably, in the longest of actually having a need for these vacant units. So we're encouraging the normal operations, keep rocking and rolling with what the housing authority is, what your mission is, and that's housing families.
Sure, I understand that. I think it's just that some sites might need to weigh the risks and benefits of having, new units being occupied. So for instance, an elderly disabled property that may have one or more cases of COVID-19, we may not be as, excited to go ahead and fill up those remaining units if there's any kind of a public health risk.
It could be, it's worth submitting, but we can't just give you a blanket answer and say, yeah, because we haven't been given that indication from headquarters yet.
Sure, that's completely understandable. Thank you.
Yeah. And one thing I wanted to note too, I know this was really one of the bigger questions when FOS first started coming out. People were disagreeing with their score. And whether you agreed or didn't agree, here was the score. You put in the information in, FDS, these are your line items. You know what your score is and can do the calculation before we even get it. It's not, it's like what I was telling Regina the other day. I said, it's not that fuzzy math that our kids are learning in school. This is the real, easy math. The line items for the numbers and the formulas are in your own FDS submission. So do the math, do it quarterly to see where you're at in progressing through, and do you need to do some more. The biggest cause for substandard housing authorities is really because of occupancy, but we are seeing more housing authorities that are having the financial problems and the physical problems too. So don't ignore, those scores that are starting to slip with the brick and mortar side of things. Get the pre-inspection to help, figure things out and increase your score. Anybody else have any other questions?
I think I saw one from Mr. Polar.
Hey.
No way.
Hi, Mr. Polar.
Hey, Regina, you have a great job today. Well, I wanted to chime in on the question about the FDS, right? We're not going to score until March. I think it's March 21 fiscal year ends. We're not going to resume scoring unless you want to be scored. So
Unless you want to
then-
be scored. Yes, sir.
right. So by then the questions about the FDS reporting related to COVID, hopefully that's all worked itself out. But the question about the occupancy, I think, is a really good question, and it's not just occupancy; it's also rent collections, right? We are really encouraging housing authorities to be generous and entering into repayment agreements and avoid evicting families, and so those repayment agreements can affect your TAR score for potentially years, depending on how long your repayment agreement is. So I think it's a good question. Is HUD going to cut you some slack on the occupancy and TARS measure? And I think I've already asked those questions with REAC and others have, and so I think there's going to be more discussions about it. Groups like NARO that you're participating today, they certainly talk with the department about these things. So I think it's a really good point. While, as Eva said, we really don't have anything yet, I'd be surprised if we don't see something on that. That was it.
Thank you, Mr. Polar. Appreciate it.
But we encourage you to submit the question to the CARES Act email address, because you're not going to get the good answers unless you're submitting the good questions.
Definitely.
So, and Regina, what's your phone number if anybody has any questions?
Sure, of course, we are working from teleworking. So I will give you my cell number. It is 214-500-6669. And I think I saw Mr. Gully pop in. I'm not sure if he's still here, but
Yes. Good
hi,
afternoon.
Mr. Gully. I would
I've been,
like,
you all did a great job.
I would just like to introduce Mr. Gully. He's our new director in the Fort Worth office. He's coming with the wealth of knowledge from the city that never sleeps, New Orleans. So we're happy to have you, Mr. Gully. Just wanted to introduce you to everyone. Thank you for joining us. And I'm sure
Good afternoon,
Mr.
everyone.
Mr. Polar. Mr. Polar was with our office for, I think, 8 to 9 months, Mr. Polar, going in between San Antonio and Fort Worth. And he was our director, our interim director, for about 8 months or so. So thank you for joining also, Mr. Polar. We appreciate you.
No problem.
I think it was a year, Regina, believe
Was
it
it
or
a
not.
year? Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Yep, it was a year.
Wow.
Over a year.
You have anything else, Eva?
I don't.
Okay. With that, unless you have anything else, you have my number, please feel free to call me. I will help as best I can. But we're done for today with Phas. Thank you.